And let's continue with and possibly finish the third chapter of the Darkangel, which is called The Duarough, which is a name I've had trouble pronouncing. I've probably pronounced it several different ways. It's supposed to be like a dwarf, so we'll call it a Duarough. Ariel met him in the garden. If it's too sunny, he kind of turns to stone. He has to stay in the shade. She couldn't find any food to eat in the garden, so the Duarough, is taking her underground to his caverns to look for something to eat, and that is where we pick up the story. The caverns were vast, great hollows in the bedrock on which the castle stood. They stretched on in a winding chain far beyond the limit of the pale rushlight the Duarough held up high. A gleaming river ran out of the endless chain of caverns to the left, through the high-ceilinged natural hall into which they were emerging, and away down to the right, where Ariel could hear the waters splashing echoed back through a myriad of long vaulted chambers. "Where does it lead?" said Ariel. "Miles and miles," the Duarough replied. "Oh, heavens, child, I've never had the time to follow. All the way to eternity, for all I know." He hopped off the last step of the tunnel of stairs they had taken down into the earth from the garden. "Now come along," he said. "We shall have to wade." He stepped out onto the sandy bank, and Ariel followed. The sand lay smooth and white as sawdust, felt at the same time soft and gritty. The water was warm, the current swift but not treacherous, and Ariel realized its lights were not merely the reflection of the Duarough's torch, but an actual property of the water. Ariel stopped in midstream, cupped her hands to the water, and brought it to her lips. There was a taste of minerals in it, vaguely saline, and a soothing, almost herbal fragrance that settled her stomach and steadied her. She drank again and followed the Duarough to the opposite bank. He led her along the cavern wall then for a little way. It was of smooth white limestone, and sprang up only a pace or two from the river bank. They came to a place where the wall doubled back a step, though the river did not, before running on, and there in the shadow of that narrow niche was an ivory door, invisible until the Duarough held up his rushlight to it and pushed it aside. It gave easily. There was a narrow passage for a few steps, and then a great chamber of white limestone, bare as anything but a small heap of sticks in the middle. They burned merrily, leapt in white flame, being dry and gray as desert driftwood. The Duarough went forward into the chamber. His rush was almost burnt out, and tossed it into the little blaze. "Come, girl," said the Duarough. "Sit by the fire and rest while I fetch us some food, for I have not eaten in as long as you, probably longer." Then he hobbled off across the room. His legs were very short, and disappeared through a door in the wall, when Ariel had not noticed before. It was, like the other, carefully concealed by the shadows and unevenness of the wall. She sat by the fire, watching the pungent wood smoke rise to the ceiling in a thin white line, where it pooled and filled the little pocks and pockets there. Ariel had never seen a wood fire before. The people in her village burned oil lamps in jars or candles. Presently she heard the Duarough returning on the other side of the little door, ambling along and mumbling a quiet tune to himself. His arms were laden with fruits and berries. He knelt down beside the fire and spread them out, Ariel staring at the quantity and variety of it all. "Well, eat," the Duarough said, "and you had best be quick, or I shall eat it all myself." Then he immediately fell to, and Ariel followed. There were quinces and lemons and pale mauve citrons, pearl nuts and fanworts, and pumpkins of gold. There was bitter gum saproot and taproot of cane, and squat milky mushrooms, sweeter than nut meat and smoother than curd. There were fish, too, dead ones. Ariel was astonished. "You eat them?" she asked the Duarough. "Fish? Certainly, daughter," the Duarough replied, offering her some. "That is what they are for." Ariel tasted a bit of the moist white flesh. It was warm and tender on her tongue. "But they are dead," said Ariel. "How is it their bodies have not fallen into ash?" Mumbled the Duarough, munching on almonds now. "Oh, the cooking does that." Ariel ate of the little man's provender until no more was left. For the Duarough, it seemed, was fully as hungry as she. She realized that, after all, he had not eaten since before sunrise. though since he had been dead stone most of the while, not living flesh, she was surprised he should have developed such an appetite. At any rate, it made no matter, for between them they both ate quite enough. "Where does all this come from?" asked Ariel, when they were done. Her host was busy collecting the leavings of their feast. "The food? From the caves, from the stream," he said, looking up. "Here is life. The water." "The water," said Ariel. "It's warm. Where does it come from?" "From the ground, daughter, from the earth." Ariel felt a frown creasing her brow. "But it's warm," she said. "Water out of the ground is cold." The Darrow nodded. "Aye, still water, dead water. But this is real water, girl. It runs and glows and bubbles with life." "But so much of it," answered Ariel, thinking of the depth and breadth of the stream. "Much!" her companion cried. "That's barely a trickle. Ah, if you could have seen the caves of Aderlawn, as I did in my childhood," he sighed. "Water still fell from the sky in my youth and swelled the rivers. We called it rain." "From the sky?" said Ariel, for wonder. "How long ago were the days of your youth?" "A dozen, 1,000 day-months past," he said, and fell silent for a little space. Presently he glanced at Ariel again. "Well, where did you think the water went when the seas receded and the land arose?" He laughed a little sadly. "Underground, daughter, underground. Here is life." Ariel swallowed the last quince seed, smiled a little timidly, said nothing. "Come," the Darrow said, pocketing the last of the scraps. "Are you rested? I want to show you the caves." "Now then," the Darrow said, rising from beside the little fire where he and Ariel had just had their repast. He dusted off the backside of his robe with his hands. "This used to be the great treasure room. It's quite empty, of course, now. They took it all with them when the Queen and her people removed across the Sea of Dust to Esternice. All that is, except the blade adamantine, which was lost in these caverns long ago. He still comes down here looking for it sometimes." "Who?" said Ariel, rising with him now from the hard lime floor. "The vampire, of course," the Darrow replied. "Surely you know the prophecy, no? By the wardens of the world, where have you lived all your life, child? That only by the hoof of the star-horse and the edge of adamant may be undone. And his 6 brethren with him, they are invulnerable to blades of mortals, but the blade adamantine was not forged in this world by mortals, but by the ancestors, the ancients, the heaven-born of Oceanus." He eyed Ariel closely, and then she gazed back at him with a frown of puzzlement. "Child, you've never heard of the heaven-born?" Ariel shook her head. "Only in whispers and oaths," she answered. "And prayers." She remembered her own desperate petition to the unknown nameless ones, as she had ascended the steeps long ago that dawn, and blushed now to think of her presumption. She did not even know so much about them as their names. "Not heard of the heaven-born?" the Darrow snorted. "Why, it was they who grafted life onto the land. This planet was a dead world before they came. They unlocked the water from the ground, created the atmosphere, and bound it lest it bleed off into the heavens. They found the old seeds lying dormant and revived them, then bred their own herbs with them to create new plants for this world." He gestured about him as if to take in the whole planet. Ariel stared at him in wonder. "They brought the animals," he said, "newly created for this world and us, even as they made daughter to farm the land and mine the caves." He folded his arms then, shook his head. "They themselves lived in domed cities in the desert, for the air was too thin for them to breathe long and live," he sighed. "They were our creators and our guides, for they were very wise. But they are all gone now. Great wars on their homeland destroyed them, or perhaps it was only their ships they lost, so they could no longer plunge across the deep heavens from their far world of blue water and cloud." Ariel gazed at him and felt weak, marveling at his knowledge. He shrugged a little and smiled ever so slightly. "Perhaps we shall yet live to see them come again," he sighed. "But enough of this. "The caves! Come with me!" He bent to lift a piece of burning driftwood from the fire and led her out of the great storehouse, through the hidden door he had taken to fetch the food. Ariel followed him through a long series of lesser chambers that had been, the Duarough said, storehouses of the greatest treasures, rooms unknown to anybody but the king and queen of the castle and their treasure. And always from the left, as they walked, came the sound of running water. "If ever you get lost in these caves," her guide informed her, "just follow the water and you'll find your way out." Presently the tunnel of rooms bore right a little, and Ariel could hear the water ahead of them, as well as from the left. They came to the last room, which seemed to end with no door to a chamber beyond, but the Duarough walked on without pause to the far corner, though it was no smooth, straight joining of plates, for all the rooms were rounded and irregular in shape, and slipped through a little door that Ariel could not see until she was almost upon it. They emerged onto the sandy bank of the river, upstream from where they had been. Ariel turned and stared down along the bank for the stairs to the garden, but the last step of which she could just make out, around the far bend. But the Duarough turned upstream. "Come along," he said. "There is a way out closer than that." Ariel turned around and followed him. "May I come down to these caves sometimes?" she inquired. "They are very beautiful, far more beautiful than the Icarus castle." "I should say," replied the dwarf. The Duarough replied, "and by much. Here there is life, and that cold tour up there holds only death and death. And as for the coming down sometimes, of a certain you may. You will have to if you want to eat, and I shall welcome you. I haven't had someone to talk to for ages." They waded back across the stream. "The other one, the one before you," the Duarough continued, "she stopped talking after a while. Those loathsome wraiths did it to her, I'm sure. Poor dear, she went quite mad, as they in the end. Here we are." He had reached a narrow stair, which instead of carving a tunnel into the rock as the garden stair had done, was cut into the side of the rock face, and descended the wall in a slippery, uneven row of steps. The Duarough motioned her up the stair ahead of him. The white torchlight wavered and danced behind her now, as she ascended into the shadows, where the light of the river barely reached. "Where does this lead?" she asked the Duarough. "Up to the castle," he said. "It opens into the corridor by the servants' quarters. There are some nice little rooms about. You might like to choose one of them for your own. It is away from the noise of the gargoyles and the wraiths when they decide to start moaning. Oh, I almost forgot." Ariel paused on the stair and half-turned, for her torch-bearer had stopped and was now rummaging in the many folds of his full grey robe. "Ah," he said, and drew from his pocket a little object of gold, not the white zinc gold or pale electrum of her people usually called gold, but true fallow gold, more tawny than anything Ariel had ever seen before. "You'll need this if you want to spin for the wraiths," said the Duarough, and handed it to her. "Your spindle." It was indeed a spindle, tiny enough to cup in her hand, but weighty as lead. Ariel held it in her hands and wondered at the delicacy of its make. "One of the few trinkets the Queen left behind," he informed her. "But," said Ariel at last, "how shall I use it? I have found nothing yet to spin." "Nor will you," the Duarough said. "If you mean to search in the garden or the castle for flax silk or fibre, there is none. No, what you spin must be of yourself." "I have not hair enough on my head to make even one kirtle," stammered Ariel. And at this the Duarough laughed, a surprising, hearty, deep-throated laugh for such a little man. "I can see that you are not acquainted with the singular properties of this golden spindle," he said after a moment, regaining himself. "This spindle spins from the heart, child. Joy, sorrow, anger, hate, whatever you feel in your heart, this spindle will spin. The last one before you, she spun on it pity and loathing. That was all she could manage in the company of those dreadful wraiths. And I can little blame her, but such garments fall to pieces in only scant time, and they are too heavy for the race to bear. No, I think you must find something else to spin on this spindle, daughter." He gestured up the stairs. "Go along now, girl. The door to the castle is only a few steps up." And there we will pause.